Order, order. Can I welcome everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee and bid a particular welcome to our three witnesses, Sir Ian, Baroness Stroud and Mr Bryan. All of you played a central role in the implementation of this biggest change in the social security system for many decades, and we're very grateful to all of you for sparing us the time to join us this morning. Can I start with the first question? And really this is, I think, primarily, Ian, for you. Can you tell us, is the 5-week wait, which is inherent in universal credit, is it, in your view, kind of hardwired into universal credit, or can it be changed?
I think I'm on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
No, the 5-week wait was never originally part of the structural plan for universal credit. It was a monthly payment, which equates to approximately 4 weeks. That was the original structure. The 5 and 6 week wait, we forget that there was a 6th week until fairly recently involved, were additions brought in after 2015. They were not brought in, I don't think, for elements of efficiency. They were brought in because there was a view that the wait period could be longer. That was not particularly my view. But having said that, I've checked also with DWP now, and they don't believe anybody is having to wait for payment now 5 weeks. They think that they are making the payments, including advances if necessary, within the 4 weeks. So if the answer to your question, can it be changed? Yes. Would I change it right now? No, because the scale of uplift that that universal credit will be dealing with now, when you think there's something like 2.5 million claims gone through, and to be honest with you, and we're all honest about this, we anticipate an even bigger uplift in the coming months. We hope not, but businesses as they go under may well, people either by having lower hours work will fall back onto universal credit, or being completely unemployed. So my general view is that I would do nothing to on this score to change it at this particular stage. But can it be changed? The answer is yes, because it was a policy element that was a decision made. As I said, not something I necessarily agreed with at the time.
Okay. We've been told that most people claiming universal credit having left a previous job, are weekly or fortnightly rather than monthly paid, and many of them don't have the savings to get through 5 weeks. How strong do you think the case is for universal credit to support people like that better than it does at the moment?
Well, I think a lot of the adjustments have been made to make sure that advances are paid very quickly. I was asking the DWP the other day, and these advances are now paid almost immediately if somebody identifies that they are going to have an issue or a problem with the wait. So first of all, it was always integral to the structure that there would be flexibility within the job centre to be able to make arrangements. But if I just track back slightly to explain what this was all about, the idea was that the vast majority of people out there are working on monthly contracts. And as we know, most people who fall unemployed, the vast majority, rotate back in normal times into employment pretty quickly. Within 6 months, I think over 70 to 80% of those who fall unemployed will go back in. I would think, and most of the figures show that the vast majority of those would have been themselves on monthly contracts. So the key point about the universal credit wasn't just a payment mechanism. It was always designed to identify those who would be most in need and would struggle and will have those struggles. And that's why universal support was designed to wrap around it, so that those who had problems with debt and issues concerning the management of their money, for example, that you would then intervene directly with them to make sure that their money was available for them. And also, more than that, that you would work both with local government and with local organizations like Citizens Advice to ensure that they went on to programs to help them with their debt. So universal credit was meant to be a departure from just a payment mechanism to become a mechanism that identifies people with problems and then try and find ways of intervening with them. And the key element to this is the payment itself was directed at that, and that's why the structure around 4 weeks was identified. Those who come into unemployment but pretty much themselves get themselves going and out, you don't want to have them suddenly having to change everything that they do just to be able to do for a period of maybe a month and a half and then change again as they go back into contract. Get them out and into employment as quickly as possible. Those who have difficulty, that's where the real effort from the job centres and then all the others, as I say, that's why it's so important that at some stage we get on to universal support, because this was designed as part of the original system.
Yeah, one of my colleagues would like to ask you about universal support a little bit later on. I can see Baroness Stroud wants to come in, and I think Debbie Abrahams has got a point to pick up. Baroness Stroud.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Ian was saying there. Universal credit, when it was conceived, was designed to mimic work as closely as possible. So if, for instance, somebody was paid on a monthly basis, then we wanted universal credit to mimic that, so that the rhythm of the claimant was as close to the experience of work as possible. And we were aware at the time, obviously, that some people are paid weekly and some people are paid fortnightly, and that not everybody is paid monthly. So the department did a piece of work to assess how most people are paid, and obviously that is, as Ian said, monthly. We wanted at the time to be able to construct a universal credit system that if you were paid weekly, you would receive it weekly. If you were paid fortnightly, fortnightly, and if you paid monthly, monthly. That at the time was not possible to do in the digital system. But I suspect now that the whole machinery is so much more stable, and people are so much more experienced in knowing how to make changes, that would be something that would be really worthwhile revisiting, because then it could mimic every form of work: a weekly payment, a fortnightly, and a monthly.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, I think the Resolution Foundation says that over half of universal credit claimants were either paid fortnightly or weekly in their previous job rather than monthly. So that would be very interesting if it was. Can I
just add something
to that? Yes, please do.
That may well be partly because of the cohort of new claimants. But when you bring the tax credit system over in its entirety, you may find that those proportions change a little.
Okay. Thank you.
And you'll see. Can I just come in on this one? It's quite important.
Yeah.
As I tried to point out, the answer to your question is, can these changes be made? The answer is yes. I'm pretty certain they can be going forward, and you can have greater flexibility within that. But all I was observing is that right now, because so much of the effort is to make sure people are on and paid as quickly as possible, making a structural change would not be a good idea. But I don't think there's an issue now that universal credit is stable and people understand how this digital system is working. By the way, I do genuinely just want to make the point, it is working and people are getting their money, and it's critical that if it had been another system with queues into job centres, you could still be seeing the first ones trying to get their money at the moment. So the pluses are that it works, it functions, etc. Can you make changes?
Yeah.
Yes, but I wouldn't do them now.
I just want to make the point that our report last week made that point explicitly. The universal credit system undoubtedly has done a good job in getting a lot of help to a lot of people in a short time and efficiently over the last few months. That's been a critically important success, I think. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. I was just looking at the transcript from your evidence to the Lords Economic Affairs Select Committee, and I think you made the point that similar to what you've been saying today, that it wasn't an ideological reason for having the delay. It was a practical one. So the practical one that you mentioned at the Select Committee was in relation to validation and verification. Is that still the case? I mean, I'm quite heartened, I have to say, with what Baroness Stroud has just said, that originally it was to mimic the world of work, and we know, as Stephen has just said, that most people on universal credit, it may not be most people across all employment, but most people on universal credit are paid weekly or fortnight. So if it's not a practical issue in terms of changing the payment process to weekly or fortnightly, and given that most people on universal credit are paid weekly and fortnightly, can we look forward to that change, do you think? Is it a reasonable request that the committee makes?
Sorry, Mr.
Surya.
Chairman, you want me to come in?
Please, if you're able to.
I apologise, Jose Rooms. I only heard bits and pieces of yours, but I think I got the trend of where you were going. The point that was being made by Baroness Stroud is absolutely right, which is that the longer the whole digital program, which is, by the way, I think the largest in the world, has actually demonstrated and proven to them, as it's bedded down, that they have greater flexibilities. I think that's no question. They understand it better. They understand what it's capable of, what it's not. The one thing about the first payment is that within all of that time, they have to make sure they identify to cut down on elements of fraud or wrongful claims because they misunderstood something. Talking to the DWP, they do have concerns that that takes a little bit of time. Now, you're obviously going to have to take evidence from them about this matter, and I do suggest that you do. What I get back from them now is that in those first few weeks, they need some time to make sure that they have got those facts right. In subsequent months, I think it's wholly feasible to bring this down and to make it more flexible. How flexible you can make it in the first month, well, that's a matter really, and I'm not that close right now to where they are, but I would suggest that's an answer that they'll have to give you. But it was not ideological, to come back to your point. It's absolutely critical to try and mirror the world of work and be as flexible as possible. And going forward, I would think that universal credit, as it settles down with tax credits coming in, providing, of course, I'm sure you're going to ask me this question later on, they don't carry the debt from tax credits over into universal credit, which I think is a major mistake, then that will make it easier to make these flexible changes.
Thank you. Mr. Bryan, I think, wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, I think as you're thinking about payment frequency, it's important to separate the assessment free period versus the payment period, because I think it's quite easy to increase the frequency of payment. But one of the reasons why we started with monthly was to make sure we had captured a full pay cycle of pretty well everybody, or even multiple pay cycles for some. So what you don't want to do is set up a system whereby some people are being assessed fortnightly, paid fortnightly, and others assessed monthly and paid monthly, because that then traps them into certain types of jobs that are going to work for them or not. So just as you think this through, it's really important to make sure that the assessment allows for as much flexibility in the job choices people make, even if the payment frequency is helping their personal circumstances.
Thank you. Very helpful. Celine Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Lovely, thank you. Can I just follow on to the points that were just being made? Alternative payment arrangements already exist within the system, I believe, for those that can't manage a single monthly universal credit payment and are at risk of financial harm. Do you think that financial harm bar is too high, or could that mechanism be tweaked to aid claimants who are not paid monthly?
Who are you asking? Sorry, which one?
Any of you?
I don't mind to Ian, be delighted if you'd like to answer.
I hope it's not my hearing, but I'm not hearing this very clearly, I'm afraid.
Right. I think the question was whether it would be appropriate to make it easier for people to opt for more frequent than monthly payments. That option is there in the system. Should it be made easier to access?
For those people at risk from financial harm?
Well, I'm sure that Dr. Bryan would like to come in on this one, but I think this comes back to our previous answer, which is I believe the system is capable of making these changes if required. However, the question really is, how do you identify these people within the timescale available? I think that's the critical point. we can't separate the two things. There is a tendency to look at, can the system make changes? And the answer to that is, for the most part, yes. But have the practicalities of people identifying who people are and what their real problems are before making these changes, or for them inadvertently going off into the wrong area of payment, thus causing them a problem at the same time. So when you're dealing with people who are, as you termed it in Saxby, at risk, then you have to be very, very much more careful to make sure that you've identified all the facts that exist around them so that they themselves aren't identifying the wrong kind of payment for themselves. I've talked to DWP staff about this, and there's a lot of human interaction at this point that's necessary, which brings me back to the original answer, which is, in practical terms, or in technical terms, the answer is yes, but in practical terms, the DWP will need to answer this question themselves about how long will it take to be able to ensure that they have identified the real needs of an individual rather than what they might immediately perceive to be their needs, and in fact then end up with a wrong kind of payment, as Dr. Brown was saying earlier on. I don't know if Stephen wants to come in on this.
I think from a system design point of view, there's real value in people putting themselves forward as having a challenge and seeking amelioration, because that introduces information. Whereas if we automatically give everybody fortnightly or weekly payments, we don't know who's challenged. So having a system whereby people identify and saying, hey, I need more frequent payments, it A, makes sure the system is responsive, but B, then make sure that, as Ian has said, the people are responsive and within the job centres and elsewhere to address the problem. Whereas if we just automatically go to very frequent payments, a lot of issues remain under the surface. So there's an information value in the way it's been set up, which I think is very helpful.
Thank you. Baroness Stroud, you indicating.
Thank you. You were asking about the original intention as well of universal credit. And when it was first conceived of, it was conceived of as a payment mechanism, which is the taper and the work allowance, and as universal support, which was the complementing human interaction connected with the need of the individual. And those two are supposed to go hand in hand so that the payment mechanism can adapt where that is the necessary lever, but the in-person support can also adapt and provide and assess the actual needs of that person. And if somebody is at risk of financial harm, then actually they're most likely to have quite complex personal circumstances that even a payment mechanism isn't necessarily going to support them with. It may be the first step, but it won't necessarily resolve it. And universal support was supposed to be the person in the job centre saying, now can we sort out somebody to help you with your debt, or to help you work through those issues. So if you can think of it in that way, I think that a payment mechanism with support was supposed to be the vision.
Mr. Chairman, can I just stress one factor on this, which is really important? I come back to the beginning of the answer I gave to Ms. Abrams earlier. Universal credit was not designed just as a welfare payment mechanism. The purpose of it was to allow you to target those who were in the greatest difficulty and try and resolve their difficulty, which is why universal support is such a critical part of this process and therefore needs to come and eventually be invested in, so that it allows the job centre advisor to say, this is somebody with genuine and serious complex problems. I need to move them over now into the support mechanism so that we can start to deal with those problems, which will help them along. It's meant to help resolve problems, not just pay money out.
Thank you. We'll certainly come back to that. Nigel Mills.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Chair.
Elaine, I apologise.
Thank you. I did want to ask, do people moving on to universal credit from legacy benefits have different needs from people who are encountering the benefit system for the first time? And how well do you think the system copes with both of those different groups?
I'm sorry, I didn't really hear that.
I think the question was, how well does universal credit handle people coming on to benefit from different circumstances, those coming from legacy benefits, for example, versus those coming onto the benefit system for the first time?
Do you have something in mind in that question? It sounds like there's something maybe behind that. Do you have categories of people or?
Well, it's been there. So the thing that's certainly behind that question in my mind is that we have discerned that there is a very the proportion of people coming in newly post COVID-19, the number applying for advances has halved, and it's just the suggestion in my own mind is that universal credit, as we see it now, is working very well for those people who are new to the system, whereas those people coming from legacy benefits are having much greater difficulty with the 5-week wait and applying in much greater numbers for advances. Have I done you justice, Selene?
Thank you, Des.
Can I? Yeah, sorry, but you go ahead, Philip, and I'll come up.
Baroness Stroud.
Thank you. I mean, one of the reasons for that is it's a very different cohort of people coming onto universal credit now to those who have been on universal credit or on the legacy system for the last couple of years, say. So the people coming onto universal credit now will most likely have had a solid work history. They've been impacted by COVID, lost their jobs, but have a strong track record of working and may even have some savings that help tide them through. But if you have been on universal credit, say, for the last 18 months to 2 years, during the time of what has become almost, the jobs miracle season, it may well be because things have been tougher for you, and your situation may be more complex. So I think that's maybe why you're seeing a reduction in the number of advances being claimed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's also worth pointing out that a significant number of those coming across will still be in work, but on lower hours, as opposed to some of those who've been claiming previously who would have been out of work, thus claiming the unemployment section, bearing in mind universal credit pays up the hours. So what you're looking at is people whose lives are, in some cases, a little more stable because they have a clearer idea of where they are than some of those who were coming on earlier that come straight into unemployment. I have to say at this point, I'm sorry if I'm going to repeat myself, but it won't be helped by the fact that those who are coming across where any debt that they incurred as a result of overpayments through tax credits then follows them through into universal credit. I think this, I have to tell you, at the time, I thought it was a wrong decision, and I continue to campaign against that decision. Universal credit should not carry the failings of a previous benefit across with it. If they want to carry on with that debt, they have to find their own way. And many of them had been given up on by HMRC, who now see this as an opportunity to dump debt which they never claim back onto universal credit, which gives people a very difficult experience as they come across. So I hope the committee might make that recommendation that they shouldn't carry the debt across.
Interesting point. Thank you for emphasising it. Nigel Mills.
Just perhaps on that point, do you regret, Sir Ian, that the 6-week and now the 5-week wait has also given people a negative impression of UC before they actually get to experience it?
It was not my plan. I did not want it. 6 weeks or the 5 weeks for that matter. I understand that the problems of obviously making sure everybody gets on and gets properly assessed, but the original plan, as I think the others have said, was a maximum of 4-week wait, and we thought that covered it all. It was a decision made after the 2015 election. Okay,
am I right that the vision of UC is that it obviously flexes up and down depending how much you earn, so it gets the feed from HMRC, it knows how much you've had on it, it tops you up or whatever else by how much you need. And wouldn't it make sense for that design to work around what your wage payments are? So if your wages are down this week, it gave you a top up of your weekly payment or fortnightly or monthly, rather than if your wages are down this week, you'd have to wait another 3 or 4 weeks to get the top up at the end of the month. And it seems if you're trying to mirror the world of work and top up wages, you should try and line the payments of UC up, payments of wages.
Well, I guess in a perfect world, if you could get the systems to mirror exactly that, and you got employers to register weekly what their changes were, then the answer would be yes. It's not universal credit. It's the ability to get employers to register. As it is, we've had to make a radical change to the way the employers register what payment is made, so that it's now not registered once a year, but monthly. I'll let Stephen go into more details about that. But the system had to be changed at the time, and I must say we had a lot of moaning from employers about now they have to go in and make the changes once a month, and that's why it's a monthly shift. I mean, to be fair, if you compare it to tax credits, and I'm sure that the MPs on this site will, I hope, bear me out on this, but I seem to recall most years I had people coming into my surgery who had received a bill for £5,000 or £8,000 because tax credits assumed and estimated their salary for the year, only to find that it wasn't the same, and they'd been overpaid under tax credits, and then they would sit and stare at you and tell you categorically they didn't have the money to pay back. That's where a lot of that debt that I was referring to earlier. The one thing universal credit does, even on the monthly section, makes a radical difference to whether or not they find themselves in debt at the end of the year. So yeah, but it literally, I'm going to hand over to Stephen because he can explain some of the more technical aspects of what we have to do.
Thank you, Sir Ian. The idea of that flexing that you've described is exactly the principle behind universal credit. Now, I think the challenge comes back to what I was referring to earlier about the assessment period. And if everybody was paid weekly, it would be very easy to have a weekly assessment period set up, everybody's calculated, and it's done. But as you know, and as this committee has been discussing, there's a wide variety of payment frequencies. And the system started by saying, in order to have a good assessment, I have to basically frame the assessment period as being the longest cycle of the vast majority of people, which would be monthly. And that's why we started with monthly assessments. Now, to what Sir Ian was saying, getting real-time data from HMRC, ultimately from the employers via HMRC, has been a critical part of being able to be responsive. So at least within a month, the system can go up or down. Now, that's very dependent on the employers putting the accurate information in, doing so on time, and preferably also using the hashing system that validates it within the banking system. And not all employers are doing the hashing. So one issue that's coming up in some of the hard cases that we've seen in the press recently is as a result of the hashing system not being uniform and universal. So I'd say the first thing that we have to do is make sure that the hashing system works such that all employers are submitting information on time and accurately, and that can be validated. That will get rid of some of the hard cases. Then I think in a medium to longer term, it is worth looking at a more flexible assessment period. As I think I said to my evidence to the Lords Select Committee, I've been doing some work on this. I think there's a way through, but I would not suggest we make any changes in the short term simply because of where we're likely to be over the next 6 to 9 months. But as part of a medium-term plan, I think we should be exploring that in policy terms.
Yep.
So if I understand you slightly changed your position. I think you were saying you should keep a monthly assessment period, but you could have more frequent payments. Now you're suggesting it may be possible to have shorter assessment periods as well as more frequent payments.
A staged approach. At the moment, in order to deal with, as it were, the symptoms, I would suggest if we do anything, it should be to be ameliorating the payment frequency. Medium term, to deal with the underlying causes, let's review how the assessment period is calculated.
And do you think there's enough flexibility in the bill? Because, I mean, we're giving people money to pay their rent, and they may only need 1 4-weekly payment for that rather than 4 1-week payments. So is it possible to have a weekly or fortnightly payment for part of the UC elements and then have a lump sum for the monthly bills? I mean, is that available in the bill structure, just to almost choose your payment mix, however that works for you?
I wouldn't go down that. Sorry, Stephen, did you want?
I think I keep it. I think if I'm hearing you correctly, you're talking about the build structure, as in the IT system, as opposed to the I think Sir Ian has outlined a good starting point. We need to keep it, still need to keep it as simple as possible. So I would say let's do one step of increasing the frequency of payment. Let's do one step of increasing the frequency of assessment. But But I think all the lessons we learned from the early days is to keep it as simple as possible as we develop it.
It's worth also reminding ourselves that if this is trying to help people identify those people who can't cope and those who can to get on with it, bear in mind that in the world of work, you're not going to get a separate housing payment. You're not going to get a separate payment for this and that. You're going to get a salary. And that salary then has to be divided up by you to be able to pay your bills. So the critical element of universal credit and the real philosophical design of it is to try and help people come to terms with what is going to happen to them or happening to them when they're in the world of work. So they get that support from DWP, the advances, etc. And as Stephen has been saying, in future, some flexibility around the actual total payment dates, which is feasible to do after assessment. But then breaking up the components of that would take you straight back to where we were before with about 6 different benefit systems and the complexity. The idea is you identify those who have problems, you try and get them resolved. That's what universal support should be about, and I do recommend that we really make a big push on that. But on the payment side of it, it's reminding people that most people know and understand that a one-off payment is what they get and they settle their own bills.
Yeah.
And that's critical.
And I would suggest that the solutions you're proposing are probably best thought of as part of a banking and payment system rather than part of a benefit system.
The Jamjar accounts that we tried to commission for a few years and never quite turned up, did they?
Well, we did do a lot of work with the banks over that. In fact, I think there was some quite significant amount of money that was spent trying to get them to help design those accounts. I happen to personally think that it is still feasible to work with the banks to make sure that they can create these systems. There's no reason why not. At the time, we just kind of ran out of time. But I do think that I hope the committee might want to look at that again, because that is one of the areas that a universal support system could help with, which is to get people put into systems where their money is then inside the banking account broken up so they can see what is apportioned for them, those who struggle with understanding payment. And that's the whole point. Again, I come back to universal support is exactly the right place for that to be.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Bryan, can I just clarify, so the kind of ultimate destination you're envisaging would be that some people would have a monthly assessment period, some people would have a fortnightly, some people would have a weekly, depending on their payment frequency in work. Is that correct?
I would avoid segmenting the assessment periods like that. What's in my mind, and I'll give you a very rough analogue rather than giving you a specific idea. If you think about how interest is calculated by banks, it's reported, you get an APR, it's maybe paid to you quarterly or monthly, but it gets inside the banking system, it gets calculated on a daily basis. So your interest on a loan or on your deposit account is calculated literally daily and wrapped up and then paid or charged on a less frequent basis. So I'm using that as an analog, but if we were to think about some way of sort of developing sort of cumulative calculations of earnings, cumulative calculations of benefit entitlement, and then at a certain frequency sort of marking them off against each other and saying, where are we, what are you now entitled to? So that you wouldn't have multiple frequencies for multiple different groups, but you try and have a base level high frequency that then can get aggregated as appropriate. So
you might have a base level weekly assessment, and then for some people you'd have 4 at a time or whatever. I see. Okay.
I wouldn't have 6 different assessment systems going at once. You'd have to have one assessment system.
One fundamental one. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Chris Stevens.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just want to check that Ian and others can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes, you're clear.
Yes, thanks, Ian. Ian, I know that when you were Secretary of State, there was always an element of test and learn, that the department was always going to try and correct things going forward. So my question to Ian first is, Ian, and particularly now in relation to recent court judgment on the assessment period, did the department in your term, or do you think it should now look at whether the claimant should pick the start date for the assessment period, and that would help them in relation to the payments of bills that they have to make? I'm
not completely up to speed with the court judgment, to be fair. I think this is related to what Dr. Brown said earlier on about how employers register the payment in this, as I understand it. And I think some of the employers are not registering. So what you get is within the timescale, they vary the date that they put payment in. I think this is the case where some people are getting what officially looks like 2 payments in 1 month and nothing in the following month. Yeah, this can be resolved, actually, funnily enough. Dr. Brown was talking about it earlier on. It's the hashing system that we're talking about here, and making sure that employers actually register and notify if they've flexed their date. You know, for example, we were talking about this a couple of days ago. If their payment date lands on a Saturday, the employer might decide, well, actually, I'm not going to do this on a Saturday. I'm going to do it on a Friday. That Friday, going backwards, might take them just outside of the next month's payment. Universal Credit, not notified about that, then immediately assumes they've had 2 payments and they get no more money because that's how it's set up. Now, I think that needs to be clearly looked at in terms of ensuring employers understand more fully how they have to make the payment and will notify Universal Credit. So there are changes that will have to be made, but that's exactly what the test and learn was about. But I think there's, I don't know if Dr. Brown wants to come in on that one, because it is one of the issues we looked at.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dr. Bryan, just as Ian's outlined there, but we're obviously concerned about constituent cases we've had of people with double payments and the consequences that has, for example, in council tax bills and the like. So the question basically is, should the claimant determine the start date, and that would be more helpful for them?
Look, I think within reason, if you think about a claimant makes a claim, so the first claim will typically have a start date or the date of the claim. This adds complexity and it would take bills time to do. But from a policy point of view, from a sort of principle point of view, plus or minus a few days to make life more stable for people would seem to be a very sensible option to add in. With an RTI system, the history of earnings can be calculated back a few weeks anyway. So if there was a willingness, from the Treasury point of view as well, to in effect advance the whole assessment period a few days to keep it more in line with payment cycles, I don't think from a policy point of view, the original idea of universal credit is not affected by such a choice. But there's a financial cost and there's a IT cost associated with it.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if Baroness Stroud has anything to add to.
No, that's fine.
Okay, thanks. Ian, obviously you'll be aware of the debates around advances, and one of the things the committee is looking at is to replace advances with non-repayable grants at some part of the process. Can I ask Ian if that was looked at in your term of office, or do you think there's now a point in the process where a non-repayable grant is better than an advance payment?
Well, can I first of all say this is a policy decision and it's not a structural issue. So whatever a government decides to do is wholly feasible to do it. We didn't look at grants. I don't recall. Maybe Philippa will recall something better than me. I don't recall looking at the grant system. What we were deliberately trying to do when we looked at the advances was to recognise that universal credit needed to be as flexible as possible when people turn up with difficulties and problems over the payment cycle that they're likely to meet of a month. So that was always put in to universal credit. We didn't look at the grants. The problem for the grant is one simple issue, which is money. So it's an issue for the Treasury to decide whether or not they're prepared to write off an initial advance or not. It's not a matter. If it was left to the DWP, I suspect they'd argue that, as far as they're concerned, it makes life easier for them because they don't have to institute any clawback. They have reacted though, because I understand that payments are not clawed back for it's a whole year, and they're at a much lower rate than they were originally. That's a matter for the Treasury, and I won't go through the discussions I've had with the Treasury in the past, only to say that they will have to decide whether they're prepared to actually stump up the money for that. Having said that, it does make it simpler for the DWP, no question, but it will cost money. But I come back to the other bit, which I'm sorry I'm going to be repeating myself, Chairman, but It's made worse by the fact that they come over from tax credits carrying a debt, which in itself is now already set to clawback. And I do think that that's something I hope the committee will focus on at some point.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, I think that we're certainly keen to pick up on the to tax credit issue, Ian. Obviously, there are people who've had to wait longer than 5 weeks for their initial payments. They may be waiting for a work capability assessment. So, do you think at that point, that after the 5 weeks, someone may be waiting for an assessment, there should be some payment made at that point to eliminate people waiting, in some cases, 8-9 weeks?
Ian, just before you come back, I know Baroness Stroud wanted to come in on the earlier point. Do you want to just comment at this point?
Thank you. Just on your earlier point, I just wanted to reiterate really that whether or not it's a grant or a loan is purely a policy choice. It doesn't alter anything structurally, and therefore is one of those choices that could be done, at a budget or whatever. It doesn't require structural change. We were obviously undertaking work on universal credit during a season of austerity, where some of the choices that appear to be available now were not available to us then. Again, just to reiterate what Ian was saying, if there is money available in the system, I would definitely put it towards the cancelling of the debt coming across, and as my first priority. Then you could look at whether or not this is a loan or grant, but the first priority, if there's money in the system, would be to go there.
Thanks, Baroness Stroud. Sorry, Ian, I was asking you about people who have to wait longer than 5 weeks for whatever reason, and the example I gave you was a work capability.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. That I checked back with the DWP the last few days. They now maintain that in the, I think it's creditable, that no one at the moment is waiting longer than 5 weeks, no matter what the outcome. They're almost getting automatic advances straight away if there's any chance that theirs is more complex to settle. So they've reduced that to literally the limit. So you can argue that in practice, the DWP is already functioning that process. So it obviously wouldn't make a major difference to them if it became a statutory process that nobody did wait longer than 5 weeks. So my answer is, I think practically it's feasible to do, as they already at the moment, it appears, doing that, full stop. So, yeah.
Thanks, Ian. My final question to you is in relation to, you'll be aware of the run-ons for people on legacy benefits transferring across. Should that also be made available to people who are entering the system for the first time, that there's some sort of run-on period?
Well, it would. I'd have to have a look at that and think of that, if you don't mind, because what are they running on from? That's the question. The reason for the run-ons were to do with housing benefit, to make sure they were stable in the crossover with tax credits, that they understood how this was working and what the differences were. I'm not quite certain what they'd be running on from. This is from falling unemployed into unemployment, or falling on to the lower hours payment of universal credit, I assume, and then coming out of work. Look, I don't have a principal objection. I just have to have a look at that. If you can give me notice of that, I can give you a written answer to that if you want.
Sure, Ian. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Sir Desmond Swain.
Ian, coming to the issue of debt, we know that many people who need an advance are not claiming for one because they're frightened of the repayments, and they're already 30% of them are already saddled with debt. You've said that we should write it off, but are you not worried about the moral hazard of people who had that money? And remember, the settlement with the debacle of tax credits was that where HMRC was responsible for the overpayment, it was written off. Where people had failed to keep them updated properly about changes in their circumstances, they had to pay it.
Can I pick this one up first? I know that Baroness Stroud will want to come in on this one because we had endless discussions about this. I want to divide the two. I'm not particularly asking for it to be written off. That's a matter for the government to decide what they do with that debt. I already know, though, if you look back through that debt, some of it is very old. and de facto was, if not written off, it was parked by HMRC early on. One of my arguments at the time was they were using what universal credit is a more efficient process for clawing back money that is owed to it because it's embedded in the system. But it was never perceived at the time of creation and launch that it would have to, when somebody was coming on, that universal credit would be picking up debt which had been parked for some time because it was too difficult to get back. That would give a very poor experience on first arrival. It may also have an impact with regards to the question, which is the whole issue of the moral hazard already in existence. We know for a fact that most people who suffer from debt issues arrive on the benefit system with already existing problems about repayments and debts. Many people who are in employment are struggling with understanding how to pay their bills. So this is an existing problem before they arrive on universal credit. What I'm arguing for is that a recognition that if the government wants to resolve the debt issue from tax credits, I don't think it should be loaded on at the initial stage to universal credit, because they're already having to move on to a very new concept of claim and payment. And I think adding into that a roll-on fear factor to that they're going to be chased for a debt which they hadn't been chased for before, I think will give them a worry about making the claim in the first place. And I think it's important to ensure people come on to universal credit knowing that this is the system that will support them at this particular stage, rather than fearing to come onto it because a debt which they haven't been particularly chased about before is suddenly going to become repayable. As I say, people mostly are already on debt before arriving on the welfare system. Some go into debt while they're there, but I think most are on having debt problems and repayment problems already.
Yes, one of the big conversations that we had when we were in the department, I think in about 14, 15, was over this tax credit debt. And, it was well known that many of the families who would be transitioning onto universal credit had no idea that they were in debt to HMRC.
Yeah.
This wasn't something that HMRC had told them about. This wasn't something that they were in an active relationship with HMRC over. There was no repayment mechanism in place. And then suddenly arriving onto universal credit, they were going to be confronted with an old tax credit bill for them to repay. And this just seemed completely inappropriate to us. If HMRC had already been in an active relationship reclaiming this money and these families had been aware of it, that would have been one thing. But to arrive onto a new system and be confronted with a debt that you are unaware of, we felt was inappropriate at the time.
Okay, so some claimants are only too eager to take an advance, sometimes an advance that may be greater than what's going to be their initial payment, without the due diligence that one would normally associate with taking on a loan. 42% of claimants have no idea that they can discuss debt with the DWP. The Trussell Trust tell us that the 3-month deferral is not widely known at all. So the question is, to what extent does the existing arrangements that DWP provide in terms of help to pay and other assistance come anywhere near your concept of universal support?
Okay, Philip will want to come in on this one, I know. So first of all, universal support has not been rolled out alongside universal credit. So it's not, do I think that it comes near to it? It's that there are a couple of places where they've done tests and trials, but the focus has not been on universal support at this stage. And I would want that to be the case going forward, because that's exactly the point. Secondly, in defense of the staff at DWP, and I was talking to some of the key players in this over the last week, they do genuinely have a very strict process that says they have to alert the claimant at the point of contact that they are eligible, if necessary, for an advance. I believe they do that. Now, there may be the odd occasion where they don't, but I do believe it's integral to universal credit that these advances are available, and they do alert them to it. And I think in this last period, and bear in mind, I think they're always tweaking the system, they now maintained, as I said earlier on, that no one now has to wait the full 5 weeks because the advances are paid, you could argue almost in an automatic way, to those who are in difficulty and won't make the 5-week support process available. So whether that information is a little out of date, I suspect that is the case. The truth is, right now, I do believe the staff have been absolutely alerted to the fact that they must make a judgment, and a quick judgment, about the need for the advance payment. So I do think that is happening. And I do think the one thing that, or all the other problems during COVID, the one thing that, the one department that does seem to have got it is DWP, with the staff absolutely determined to make those payments and make those advances. So I do think that's the case now. And I suspect when you look back over this period, and I'm sure the Chairman, you'll want to do that at some point, I think you will find that there was a step change in the way that the payments were made during this period, which I think is going to be bound into the process.
Yeah. Just to add to that, help to claim, even though it's been badged as being the same thing as universal support, is not universal support. Help to claim exists to help people gather evidence for their application and to help them prepare for their first job centre appointment. This is like a claim assistance process. Universal support was to support somebody in their financial management, in the management of their debt, in helping them think through how they were going to become financially solvent, how they were going to manage on a low income, the sort of choices that they would need to make, and to have somebody alongside them as they learnt that process. And it was meant to be like a gateway to real financial support for people on low incomes in learning how to manage their money, and multifaceted. So not just in terms of debt management, but also in terms of picking up where someone might have housing problems, picking up where somebody might, for instance, be at risk of domestic abuse. So they were nervous about making it a joint claim. But universal support was supposed to pick that up at the time of the claim. If you had language problems, universal support was supposed to ensure that you had access to learning English so that you could work effectively. So it was supposed to be the gateway to a number of different services, and it's the point of coming and claiming that actually is like a flagging system for a number of different vulnerabilities that we would have the opportunity to address.
Thank you. I think Steve McKay wants to pick up this question of universal support. So, Steve.
Yes, thank you. Morning. Well, actually, you've taken me nicely into it, because obviously what I wanted to ask, I've heard Ian talk fairly passionately about universal support in the past, and I think Dr. Bryan referred to it a bit like yourself, Barnett Stride, as a whole system of networks of support. And as you see, it appears to now have morphed into help to claim, which is really about how to make a claim, as I understand it. And I think it's Patrick Spencer who said it, universal support is the unfinished business. I really wondered, how do you think what we've ended up with compares to the vision that you had originally? And what should the department do now to provide the kind of support that you think is central to making universal credit work?
Well, first of all, if I quickly answer this, I know that Baron Stroud will want to come in on this. We worked, David Freud, Lord Freud, myself, Baron Stroud worked extensively on this parallel system because early on, universal credit works exactly as it's meant to be doing, which is to make sure people get money, they get payment, they claim the money, they get onto the system. But universal credit wasn't only designed to be a payment system. I said this earlier on, and I'll stress it again. It was set deliberately to identify people who had problems. By bringing all those benefits together, you can figure out who has the problem area. They get identified, they get seen. And so that bit, that process, then what do you do with those people? So the second bit was universal support running alongside it. They can be moved across immediately to a system and networks, debt counselling, drugs advice, all sorts of issues, working with the local authority, working with citizens advice, linked to some of the local advisory organisations and charities. That was the whole network that was going to make up. Now that requires investment, okay? So it's not just something you can say, right, here we go. Each of the local areas needs to have the money to be able to set that process up and function it alongside universal credit. And there's the reason for that is because if people can't handle their financial circumstances, they're almost certainly, if you get them into work, going to crash out of work pretty quickly because nobody's going to help them when they're in work. So the trick is try and help them now so that when they go to work, you don't end up with them coming back out. It's a practical and a social reason why you should do it. Now, the plans were all set there, but, the department has got priorities to do. So it's a policy decision now as to whether or not going forward, and I cannot stress enough, I would advise the government now to invest in universal support and to roll it out, design it. The designs were already there, to roll it out, test it. The Centre for Social Justice has already put forward a proposal, which I, of course, am part of, as to how they could do this. It really is vital because it is the critical bit as we go forward after this COVID area. There are going to be people with lots of issues and problems, and this is exactly going to be needed. So I would get on with that. That's really the critical issue. Sorry,
Baroness Stroud.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to underline everything that Ian has just said, really, but we all know that poverty is about money. And therefore, it's important that universal credit gets money to people who are those who are in need. But we also then know that it's about employment and work, which is why we sought to create a system that had work incentives all the way through it. But we also know that it's about more than that too. It's about skill level, it's about mental health level, it's about family, it's about debt. And universal support was supposed to be the gateway to all of these other services as well, so that you had this payment mechanism that meant that you had got money to people who were in need, that had full work incentives riven through it, so that there was no obstacle to going into work and progressing in work, but was the gateway to all the support structures that were needed. That was the vision of universal credit.
And would it be fair to say that although, as we've heard this morning, universal credit's become quite efficient at being a payment mechanism, actually it's only half a system and therefore it's failed because all those other things that you're referring to just don't get picked up at all. That's why people don't get into work, fall out of work, get into debt, sometimes through the advances. They don't have the support that was envisaged as the other half of the scheme. Is that a fair observation?
No. So the reason why that's not a fair observation is all you have to do is to compare it with the legacy system, which would only allow you to work 16 hours. And then would penalise you for any hour you took off that. Wouldn't allow you to progress in work with 6 different benefits. Just imagine if all the claimants who'd come onto universal credit now had to go in person to 6 different departments to claim. We would have had queues out of council offices, queues everywhere. This is the right system, but the process of reform is not finished.
No, I'm not disputing those points. I understand that. I accept that. I'm simply asking, since it seems to me that 50% of it, the support element, is absent, and I'm wondering how it can possibly meet your overall ambitions if half of it isn't being delivered.
Can I come in on this one?
Please do.
Yeah. First of all, look, I think that the universal credit as a mechanism to get money to people who are in need of that money and payment on time is designed without the problems that Baroness Stroud has talked about with queues, with multiple claims, and the chaos that would have ensued and would have ensued if we have the numbers coming on, which we expect to have as well. So number one, the DWP, the staff and everything else, I have to say, I think have done a brilliant job, and universal credit is doing what that bit of it was designed to do. So, credit to them, because I think they've been absolutely fantastic in this difficult crisis, and it hasn't reared its head throughout for the very simple reason that it worked. But, and Mr. Cave, you're right on this, that there is more. And the more is the bit that we are trying to focus on. The two elements that I have in my heart and my head are, one, can we please not bring the debt across from tax credits? Because that is, I think, unfair. And I think DWP staff would nod quietly at that, because they don't want to have to try and claw back debt, which in some cases people didn't even know they had. The second bit is a practical policy point, is universal support. It is now time, now that we understand how stable this system is now time to put alongside it the original plans that myself, Dr. Freud, Lord Freud, Baroness Stroud, Brian and others, and many in the DWP itself, who bought into this really strongly, agreed to do. It's now time for that to be invested in, and that's the key word, invested in, because by all means you can try and bring it in, but unless it's properly invested in, it won't work. Councils need that supporting money, but they need to buy into the fact this is now to support a system that works, but to do what it once was designed to do, finally, which is to help people in difficulty get out of their difficulty.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ian, could you tell us what the scale of investment that's needed is, do you think? Have you got a figure for that?
Well, I haven't brought it with me, but it's in the report from the Centre for Social Justice, which I think you have. If you don't, I shall ensure you get it.
Fine. Thank you very much. Can I just ask one final question to Dr. Bryan? And you and I had a very brief conversation about this in 2010 or 2011, I think. At that time, the plan was that the transition to universal credit was going to be completed within 7 years, by October 2017. We now know that it's going to have taken at least twice as long as that. Looking back on that experience and the difficulties with the IT and so on, what lessons do you think should be learnt about planning for this sort of system in the future?
I think the first lesson is to start small and simple. And I would say that, if you look at the experience of universal credit through the sort of 2013, 14, 15 time period, there was a massive learning and a massive improvement in the way it was being developed, and really starting with a core, simple system, simple user journey, and building it from there. And I would say that if we had been doing that at the very beginning, we would probably have been in a much better place. I think the other has been to be cautious and to really make sure we have succeeded at every step. So unlike other reforms, the system has been rolled out carefully and has succeeded at every stage. There can be debates about that pace a little bit, but I think in the end of the day, it is much better to focus on the segments of the population who benefit most, which have been those who've fallen into unemployment, versus those who are on a sort of stable system elsewhere. So I think that sort of started simple, steady rollout, and very much thinking through prioritizing those who are going to benefit most rather than administrative changes would be the lessons I think we've learned from this.
Thank you very much. That brings our session to a conclusion. Thank you, all three of you, for giving us your time this morning and for very, very helpful and interesting answers that will be very useful to us, I think, as we formulate some recommendations for the government over the next few weeks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can I then welcome our second panel, who I can see on the screen in front of us. Thank you very much for joining us. I wonder whether I could ask each of you, please, to briefly introduce yourself. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, three of you. I wonder if I can ask you each to briefly introduce yourselves and tell the committee who you are, starting with Phil Booth.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm Phil Booth. I coordinate Med Confidential. We look at where health and social care data goes. And we're here, I guess, because DWP wants to copy, create and control a health record for each claimant. The committee's already heard about how DWP rejects evidence submitted to disability assessments from NHS doctors, but yet we still see DWP insisting it should have access to the NHS patient data that those same doctors create.
Okay, thank you very much. Tom Loosemore.
Tom Loosemore, I am a partner in Public Digital Limited. We help governments all over the world adapt to the internet era. However, I was also part of the Major Projects Authority review of Universal Credit in January 2013 that resulted in the reset of the programme that Dr. Bryan alluded to recently. And I actually stayed on after the reset to create and start the team that then started small, building a first version, and it's very good to hear Dr. Bryan say that was the start of things going right. So I'd agree with him, obviously.
Thank you very much. And Gareth Morgan.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Chief Executive at Ferret Information Systems, and we have, for a very long time, produced advice and information systems about entitlement to benefits, and we also do modelling and training in that area.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Mr. Loosemore, can I start going back to points you were just starting to make there and Dr. Bryan's answer at the end of the previous session? There was this reset some years into the programme. What would you say went wrong at the start and had to be changed?
Hubris was what went wrong at the start in several dimensions. I think an underestimation by the department, not so much by ministers to be fair, by the department, of just how significant a change universal credit represented. Fundamental change to more than just moving to a continuous dynamic benefit. It was shifting to how the model of a claim worked, full stop, who a claimant was. I think this was underestimated. I think there was an overconfidence in DWP that they could deliver what they perceived to be large IT projects. This is not a large IT project. That framing was wrong. This is a fundamental change into a welfare support system. It is a system. And so there was a separation, but they went far too big, far too fast, bringing in the wrong kind of partners, in my opinion, bringing in big systems integrators who love to spend hundreds of millions of pounds on shiny technology, when actually the core thing that needed to happen at the start was to bring together policy, operations, and some technologists and designers to start small and iterate and learn, because there's so much to learn given the scale of the changes. And I think that hubris and then that defensiveness and the unwillingness, the incredible unwillingness to tell ministers what was actually happening. It was a very toxic environment, truth be told, that I walked into. And a lot of people were very badly damaged. A lot of people who worked incredibly hard in DWP were very badly damaged by that toxicity. I had to move the team to a separate building and lock the door in 2013 to start the reset process. It was that bad. So I'm really delighted that that team has now morphed into what I think is one of the, in fact, I think it's probably the best team I know globally working in internet era delivery. I think they are that good. I think there are clearly lots of issues left with the policy, but when it comes to a delivery team, or 14 teams actually, it's 14 separate small teams, they are exceptional. And I have enormous respect for the people involved.
Okay. Thank you. It's very helpful. You were involved in the reset. Everything was done, we were told, in Agile, partly so that it could be changed, the system could be changed when it became clear it needed to be changed. But we're now being told that some of the changes that some people think might be helpful are very difficult and are going to take quite a long time to make. Do you think the system as it now stands could be changed relatively quickly given the determination to make such changes, or is it right that major changes would take a long time to implement?
I'm going to sadly give an answer that says yes and no, because some changes, because of the agility of the team, are genuinely technology changes and are relatively simple. So, for example, we have not yet heard this idea, but shifting everybody, all payments in universal credit, from backs to faster payments, which would take a whole bunch of delay out from even within the sort of 5-week time frame, that would be relatively trivial. And there's a bunch of other changes like that, improving the user journey that people go through, etc., where the agility you can utilize. However, there are some fundamental building blocks that underpin the rules of universal credit, and I'm afraid to say that the assessment period is one of them, where it's not the technology that constrains the change. It's the very DNA of the whole welfare system, I'm afraid, has the notion of a monthly assessment period baked in. That was a decision made in 2010-11 in the legislation that means any changes are going to require an enormous ripple effect into a whole range of other different systems, be that RTI, be that debt, be that, there's probably dozens of other systems that rely on a monthly rhythm to inject data, export data from universal credit. I think the analogy I would give is you could perceive, it's not ideal analogy, but you could perceive universal credit as a set of Lego bricks from which you can build and adapt a system. And those Lego bricks are adaptable. However, the monthly payment system is really the size of those cylindrical nodules on the top of each brick. If you change that, the bricks won't fit together anymore. And if you sort of mangle it and force it to, it's not going to be strong and it's not going to be stable. So I'm afraid I have much less confidence about the policy ideas, the policy checks that are being written, including by former ministers, that the operations and delivery team in DWP would really struggle to cash. And I'm sorry to be a naysayer about such matters.
That's fine. But I mean, it was actually Dr. Bryan who suggested that you could have a kind of weekly rhythm and then build that up to a monthly period. He suggested a daily rhythm, and then almost like daily interest, and then accreting up to a weekly or other systems. And again, there's a separation between payment periods and assessment periods. I would. If you were going to start again, that would be a lovely, interesting idea. And personally, I'd very much be in favour of that. And I said that to people involved in the programme only a matter of months ago. We are not starting again. We have 5 million plus people on this system. The scale of change, we have a whole bunch more coming on, sadly, either with managed migration or because the economy is going to struggle. The thought of changing something that fundamental. Imagine you've built a beautiful model of a starship in Lego and then suddenly you change the size of those little cylinders. You have to replace your whole model and you have to deal with the fact you want to keep building things. I'm afraid operationally, from my perspective, it's a total non-starter. Okay, thank you. Debbie Abraham wanted to come in, I think, point here.
Thanks. So this is a practical issue, and what specifically in a practical, is it the verification that we heard about earlier on? What is the real issue in the system that the assessment period, in spite of what the previous panelist was saying, it's going to be very hard to change it?
It's because all the system is not one system; it is a system of systems. And we've heard about RTI, which is HMRC's system for collecting how much money people are paid through their salary from employers. That's one of the systems it integrates with. And but there are dozens more: debt management, CIS, CPS, local authority systems, child maintenance, the court system, utility companies. I could go on and on and on and on. These are all systems that share data in order to make sure that the calculation is correct. If you change the assessment period, you are fundamentally changing the lingua franca of those conversations between systems. And that is not just changes that Universal Credit Team would have to make, would be gargantuan, and would eat up years of time, literally years of time, but you'd have to make sure that your partner organisations, be that local authorities, utility companies, HMRC, all the employers in the country, they would also have to change their lingua franca to speak daily rather than monthly. It's almost like you're changing the language that the system speaks in. And yes, you can do it. You can do anything. We can get to the moon if we want to, but you really shouldn't. It's not worth it. There are other better ways, I think, of ameliorating some of the very real issues that come from that monthly assessment.
Thank you. Nigel Mills.
I suppose while we're on that topic, what would be the better ways of ameliorating those issues that come from the monthly assessment?
I mean, the first most obvious one, I simply do not understand why all payments aren't made using the new faster payments mechanism that pays 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I know why. It's because Treasury doesn't want to cough up the money, but frankly, that's not a good enough reason. And that adds, potentially up to 4 days to people's payment regimes. I would also look quite closely. I would also totally agree. I don't think I've ever totally agreed with Surian ever before in my life, but I would totally agree with him about the transfer of debt from legacy debt from tax credits. I think that's a disaster waiting to happen. I would look at challenging how advances are repaid. I think shifting to a model whereby you don't have to pay 30%, you maybe pay slightly less, and over a longer period, that would ameliorate some of the issues. And I think Dr. Bryan's point around slightly technical language, but making sure employers do cross-reference their monthly payments correctly with the bank system, that would help a lot. I think as people transition onto the system from legacy benefits, giving them the choice about when to start so that the dates align better, that would be a very good idea. I don't personally see any huge issues with that, but again, I'm not at the sharp end of this and others are.
So you advocate allowing me to, if I'm being paid on the last working day of a month, to choose my UC payment to be generally early in the next month, so there's time for the RTI fee to work.
Correct. So you avoid this this very tricky issue, not even this disastrous issues for those that get paid twice a month and not in the other. You do that by design from the start, and you explain to people that it's going to make your life easier. It's a bit like you sometimes get choice with some employers when you get paid monthly, not many, but some do, and they do that so you can manage your payment regime, your own budget better. I mean, there's a bunch of other ideas like this, and again, if you talk to the people who run the system and operate the system, they will have many more. I would make one observation.
So can I choose multiple payments? Could I choose, I'd like 50 quid a week and the balance at the end of the month, or is that going too far?
Look, again, as Dr. Bryan said earlier, you can separate out the assessment period from the payment period. That brings with it its own challenges when you run out of money for your rent at the end of the month, but that's not an intrinsic issue with the system. What I would say, there is a big intrinsic problem that sort of links to aligns to the comments that Surian made about universal support, which is, I'm afraid, the thing that doesn't work well with the universal credit as a whole within DWP at the moment is you still have a significant gap between those who make policy and those who deliver and operate the system. They are not on the same floor. I think there's only a couple of policy people embedded in the team, where there are literally dozens and dozens of operational people embedded in every team. And you have a separate labour market policy team and a separate universal credit policy team for reasons I simply fail to understand. I'm not even sure that the Director General of Universal Credit actually has control of those policy people. So I think many of the issues some of the issues that are challenging here come from a policy cast willfully staying separate from the dirty, difficult, messy reality of people's real lives, because it's nicer that way. And I'm being pejorative, but for effect, but I mean it.
Okay, do any of the other panel members have any different views on any of this, or do you all
Mr. Morgan. Mr. Morgan first.
Yeah, I wanted simply to pick up on the choice of assessment period. I have tried modelling that, and it is extremely difficult. It may be fine for a single earner, but when you have couples involved who may be on very different pay cycles and who potentially have different cycles of paying their housing costs as well. I just haven't been able to find any way in which there is a right answer for the best date for an assessment period to start. And I think that's one of the problems with the whole of kind of the universal credit and design. I think, as has been implied already, in a sense, is when the big idea conflicted with the details, and that the problems have arisen, that the idea in its basis was very much welcomed, I think, by most people. But when it comes to implement it, it's the little details that cause the problems, because people don't have the nice, simple, standardized ways of life, and therefore their patterns of existence don't work with a constraining and standardized pattern of assessment. I think the
calendar month assessment be the most logical, though?
I'm sorry, I lost that.
Wouldn't a calendar month assessment period be the least worst option? Or is that not the case from your modelling?
I think it depends upon how you view a calendar month. I have no problems with an assessment period of 1 month. I have real problems with how the calculations within that assessment period are carried out. I mean, a lot of the problems I think that the committee is discussing are not to do with the assessment period, they're to do with the consequences of the way in which the assessment period has been used. Take the 5-week wait in itself, for example. And I think people are forgetting that it may not be just a 5-week wait. For some people, it may be a 9-week wait or more. If the first day in which you claim universal credit happens to mean that your assessment period in that first month contains 5 weekly payments, 2 monthly payments, 3 fortnightly payments, whatever, you may find that you're not entitled to benefit at all in that first month. And I'm worried that many people will see that simply as being a statement that they're not entitled to universal credit in the first place and never reclaim, which of course is what they should do. So I think there are a whole pile of issues about how you assess things within the assessment period that are the vital areas, rather than the assessment period or the frequency of payment.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Booth, I think you were indicating. Yes.
A couple of points, really. One, about how the COVID-19 crisis has shown that DWP is still doing many of these deduction calculations manually, and that is what's taking a lot of staff time. Those are staff that the department redeployed during the spike in the new COVID-related applications. But this is what it shows, that the DWP has designed processes that tended to protect the 5-week wait, which I think is why we're getting this sort of pushback saying it can't be changed. But if those deductions take some weeks to run manually, as we believe, and from what we're hearing, I think it does, then it's really it's DWP saying it, and I think as Ian said in the previous session, saying that that's why it was necessary. But that current process is what requires many people to go into debt. So if what DWP has said about things like the collection of those deductions being entirely automated after they have been calculated by hand, then there's no reason those deductions, say, couldn't start 12 months after a person's claim has begun. That would give DWP a lot more time to work things out. It would reduce the amount of work it has to do prior to start, and then allow that current 5-week wait to be reduced significantly, possibly to 2 weeks or less, making much more efficient use of DWP's own staff time. On the sort of calendar months point, and we've had lots of mention of HMRC's RTI, real-time information system. HMRC knows already whether someone is paid weekly, fortnightly, monthly. That's what comes in via the PAYE system. So we've written a report on this that shows the very screenshots they're using. So as far as we can tell, HMRC provides DWP with all of the data that DWP did ask for. Why, therefore, didn't it ask for the information on the frequency on which people are already paid? The committee might wish to ask a slightly different angled question as to where the responsibility lies. Is it HMRC not providing information, or whether DWP is itself responsible for perpetuating some of these hardship because HMRC already knows about periods and DWP seems to say it doesn't?
Mr. Morgan, you were indicating.
My understanding was that the RTIA information which is passed across from HMRC does include the payment period. Each of the fields in that data set has the payment and the length for which the payment period applies. It doesn't have the start and end dates of payment, but perhaps I'm wrong in thinking that it was passed across.
So, if the certain pieces of information are being passed across, but they are not making use of that at the DWP end, it would be worth, I think, actually getting to the bottom of that, because as Tom has said, some of these things can be tackled at the level of technical change, technical detail, and we know that this is a system that talks to many other systems, and it may well be that some of the what seem fairly intractable problems may actually be down to some of the detail that we are talking about.
Mr. Loosemore.
I just remind people that giving people the option to choose payment frequency has been tried in Scotland for a period of time. And half the people took it up. Please would I change my payment cycle? I just like to say that 60% of those change back. And I think one of the problems with this whole system is that you can sit there in your chair at home and come up with countless ideas that are simple, compelling, and wrong. And the wrongness is only apparent when you scale to millions of people. And when you've got millions of people, there are always, I'm afraid, going to be some trade-offs. And that's a very harsh thing to say, and you want to do everything you can to mitigate them, but there are going to be trade-offs. And I'd be wary of being an armchair general when it comes to these ideas.
Okay. Thank you. Steve McCabe is next.
Morning. I think I want to ask these questions mainly for Gareth Morgan, but obviously if the others want to comment, feel free. I'm interested in the ferret information system. And hello, something seems to have gone down. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I can hear you.
We can.
That's fine. I was saying I'm interested in the ferret information system and this idea that you can calculate a day rate and pay people right at the start. I wonder if you could just very briefly talk me through how it works.
I'll try. The idea is that instead of doing what we happen to see Universal Credit doing at the moment, which is taking account of all pay received in an assessment period, which means that you may have, for somebody who's paid weekly, 28 days or 35 days worth of pay, or somebody who is being paid for weekly, 28 days or 56 days of pay, and so on, and therefore skewing the calculation by increasing or decreasing the amounts of pay. And for people on last weekly day of the month payment, that might mean 1 month's pay or 2 months' pay or no month's pay. What I'm proposing is a very simple way of simply proportioning the pay that's received into the relevant assessment periods. I'm not wanting to change the assessment period month. I've constrained myself to use the data that's already being passed across by HMRC and the assessment period. And all that it simply does is to take the number of days within each pay period that fall within the assessment period and use those, passing the other days into the next assessment period. Now, the consequence of that is that you get a much more even and much smoother calculation of earnings, regardless of the pay cycles and regardless of changes in pay or of changes in length of pay cycles. The downside, if you like, is that you have to then reconcile things. So if somebody's pay period stops during an assessment period and you have to make an assessment of what the next one would be, then you have to reconcile in the following month any changes, any difference between those two rates. I don't think that's very, very difficult because firstly, unlike the tax credit system where you reconcile at the end of a tax year, you're doing it at the end of the next period. So you're much closer to the previous pay. So any extra money is probably already still around and the amounts involved will be much smaller. So I can see there being a lot of tweaking needing to be done in following assessment period, but computationally that's trivial if you've got the data. You can do that kind of sum very easily with computer systems.
So basically, it doesn't change the assessment period. It simply changes the way you estimate entitlement. I think you say something about, the current system assesses needs on the last day. You're saying you could make that estimate from the beginning. So the attraction is it wipes out the 5-week waiting period. Presumably that's the upfront attraction. But the downside is there may be inaccuracies, and when you say reconcile, we mean clawback, don't we?
Well, the reconciliation might be giving a bit extra if the assessor is lower than they actually are. But yes, it's adjusting rather than clawback. I don't think we're talking about the kind of sums that tax credit saw before their buffer was put in place. I think we're talking about things which are much more simply adjustments, overtime in 1 week but not overtime in the next week, those sorts of things. The last day of the assessment period looks at the circumstances, I think, the size of the family, the housing costs and so forth.
Yes.
We're still talking about using all of the earnings received during an assessment period at the moment. And all I'm trying to do is to take that current structural design, which gives these huge fluctuations in the earnings taken into account, and smooth them by taking into account only the earnings actually applicable to that assessment period.
And what do DWP say or ministers say when you put this proposal to them?
I haven't had the opportunity to give a formal presentation to DWP about it. I know there's been a kind of slight misunderstanding about my term of the use of day rate, because people have said that means a daily assessment, which isn't at all what I'm proposing. I simply took it down to days because that's, I suppose, computationally more elegant in that it takes account then of different assessment period lengths because of the different lengths of calendar months. But I'd be very happy to make a formal presentation of the idea if the opportunity arose.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just ask Mr. Loosemore how that sounds to you?
I don't know the details, if I'm honest. I think that a conversation with those who have to administer the scheme, which starts by saying we can get rid of the 5-week wait at the start, when that 5-week wait is not just because you need to accrete the information you need to do the calculation, but you also need to verify evidence to make sure you don't have systemic fraud, which is, let's be clear, has happened in many countries around the world during COVID, and hopefully not happened to such a degree it will have happened here. I'm not sure that would get past muster a frontline operational worker in DWP to say you can move away from 5 weeks. So, but I think the detail of how you do the calculation computationally is trivial. You could probably run the whole of universal credit on a few mobile phones. The maths is not hard. What's hard is the trade-offs, and what's the trade-offs that we're happy with. And there is going to be no perfect answer here. It's going to be which trade-offs are we happy with. And I would just go back to my earlier point. Some of those trade-offs only become apparent when you operate the system at the scale of millions. This is a complex system, not just a complicated system. And complex systems, you can put theory in at the start, but what comes out at the end is real life, and that's messy and very, very, very impossible to predict.
Mr. Morgan, I saw you waving.
Thank you. I simply wanted to say that in terms of the actual 5-week wait, I don't think this automatically removes the need for it. That is, as you say, at least partially a political decision. What it does mean is that the argument that says it's inevitable because we have to wait until the end of an assessment period to know what people's earnings were doesn't stand up if you enable people to estimate the earnings and then reconcile in the following period.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Chris Stevens.
Yes, yes, thank you, Chair. My questions are going to be mainly directed towards Mr. Booth. Obviously, I'll ask the others for their particular views. Mr. Booth, you'll be aware during this session that we've looked at advances versus repayable grants within the system, and obviously DWP have suggested that it's difficult for operational reasons and things can't be done. So Could you just explain the view of your organisation about whether a non-repayable grant is achievable?
Yes, certainly. Well, the DWP has already paused deductions for 6 months, and therefore that shows, at least on the technical level, turning advances into non-repayable grants is something that should be achievable. As Tom Loosemore said earlier, there are some categories of problems that are, relatively straightforward to do or deliver with the system built in the way that UC is. So this is more a political choice, frankly, than a technical problem. So I'd say, maybe in line with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster's speech at Ditchley this weekend, the question or the issue lies maybe more with the cost benefit to the public purse of DWP continuing to run 30-year-old legacy systems for which they have to do deductions manually. That speaks, I guess, to some of the debt that has been talked about in this session being brought across. And to do the calculation of whether ending such clawbacks would save not just capital revenue, but civil servant time, and whether in the next spending review we could see such a cost-benefit analysis.
So it doesn't sound all that difficult, does it, Mr. Booth? So how quickly do you think that the department could introduce such a system of non-repayable grants? And is there any estimation that you have of the cost of that?
So we do not have an estimation of the cost to the public purse, and as I say, that's something which should be done, where we're looking at broad policy changes. Then that calculation clearly is something which comes down to what the Treasury wants to do. And coming out of COVID, hopefully, I imagine we're going to be looking at lots of such things. In terms of the system, while I won't say it is trivial, if you are categorising one type of payment or deduction as one thing, and there are parts of the system that are able to relate to that, then to categorise, another thing accordingly means that the system will be able to deliver that sort of behaviour or performance. We've seen this, for example, around stuff like in maternity tax credit versus maternity benefit, where you've got two, what to the general public would seem to be the same thing, with getting a benefit because you're pregnant. They're treated in different ways because they're categorised as different things within the system. The system is given the category and it delivers a performance or behaviour on that sort of category that it has done before, then that should be doable. The bigger question is whether the cost to the public purse is viable.
Yeah, thank you for that. So,
Chris, can I just bring in Mr. Loosemore, who's indicating he wanted to comment as well before you?
Yes, but
just very briefly. I mean, my sense is that this is the kind of maths that it's the kind of change that would be is more doable than others. But having said that, I would just, with my international experience, work with lots of governments around the world, many of whom have looked to go to a grant-based scheme rather than an advance-based scheme. I just remember that there are people out there who run tens of millions pound fraud organisations who would look at a grant regime in the UK and go, "Thank you very much, thank you very much." So be
but that
careful.
happens now, Tom. Surely, I mean,
of course it happens now, but the scale of the prize when you shift from an advances system to a systemic grant one, I think would be much greater.
So if so let's just tease that out a bit further then, because obviously we're aware of fraud in quite a big scale with the advanced system. Would a grant system be viable once we know that someone is eligible under universal credit, that once they've passed the eligibility test, that's the place for a grant? Or would the place for a grant be, for example, someone who at the end of 5 weeks is still waiting for a payment because they may be waiting for the outcome of a work capability assessment or any of those issues? So,
yeah, I mean, I think once you've got through that initial period of essentially assessing that someone is who they say they are, and that's really where the sort of initial period at the start is, you're verifying that someone isn't just pretending to be someone else. Of course, you can choose, and it is to Phil's point, it's a policy decision about whether you make that a grant or an advance. But I think all the way through this, think like a fraudster, and having upfront grants that you can get when you walk in, just like upfront advances, it brings with it systemic risks that I think you just should consider. It's not to say couldn't be done. I think it's one of the things that could be done.
No, yeah, Tom, it sounds like there's a place for a grant somewhere in the system, maybe not in day one like the advances system, but I think that what we're trying to tease out is at some point is a grant viable? So is it viable in your view, maybe after 5 weeks for those who are still waiting, but a place for it after 2 weeks?
It doesn't sound like the kind of change that changes the size of the cylinders on the top of a Lego brick. It feels like a different kind of Lego brick. But I would just remember that every time you make one of those changes, you accrete a layer of complexity on top of a system that is complex in terms of how it interrelates to people's lives. And one of the challenges here is do people understand what's going on when it comes to the calculation? I kind of doubt they do now, given the changes that have already happened. If we add changes to what's an advance, what's a grant, you're adding complexity. And one of the key reasons to move away from the previous benefits regime was an attempt to simplify. And I just ask that you keep that simplicity front of mind, notwithstanding.
Well, I bear that in mind, but obviously one of the problems with the advance system is there's £50 million a month getting paid back into the system. So, I mean, I think that's something that no one. I see Debbie's got her hand up, Chair, so I'll maybe pass over to Debbie at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Debbie.
Thank you, Stephen. This is a question specifically to Phil in relation to sick and disabled people and the medical evidence that they have to supply. Their wait for a first payment is often much longer than 5 weeks because of this. What are you aware of the type of data that is being asked for that is separate or independent from health records, and what is being retained by the department? You mentioned at your introduction that that data is being held by the department.
So at present,
in relation to health conditions and so on.
Sorry. So at present, we're aware of, on a trial basis, there have been systems where if you like, mirror health record was being erected on Amazon Web Services. But there have been, as I say, these historic problems where data from what is someone's legitimate GP record is simply not being trusted, and instead you're going through this evaluation process by people who are medically trained but who are arriving at very, very different conclusions in some cases to the person's own doctor. It is unclear at this stage. I mean, we published, Med Confidential published a piece just yesterday on whether DWP will get direct access to NHS patients' data for fraud purposes specifically. That's under the Digital Economy Act. But at the moment, the flows are, as you say, they're sort of tied up in processes that are mainly in DWP, and when a person does have a long-term condition, a disability or something like that, it seems that DWP does not always take their own doctor's medical evidence as being sufficient. That plays out all the way down the system, unfortunately, with regard to what is being automated. That we know, for example, there's a whole bunch of cases that get to tribunal about disability benefits, and the cost, stress, of all that is enormous. But there are bits here that could be automated, which do not require retaining someone's medical record at all, but which could significantly improve people's experience of universal credit and the system. So just a very quick example. So, in terms of when someone has been found by a tribunal that they should not be reassessed for a period of, say, 3 years, DWP could, at that point, enter a don't ask people back before this date onto the claimant's record. It's got nothing to do with retaining medical data, everything to do with DWP's processes, and then people would not be, as currently happens, when the automated systems at DWP sort of spit up, oh, this person needs a reassessment. The way it works, and we know how automated system works, is it sends out all of the notifications, the person gets that, the stress of, I'm going to have to be assessed again. That doesn't actually get checked by someone at DWP until the day before the date of the assessment, at which point they realise they shouldn't be calling them for assessment and they de-escalate. So we have here a situation of where, while many bits of the system can and should be automated, you need to think about how that interfaces with people in their real lives, which I think many of the witnesses this morning have said. This gets complicated when it touches people in their real lives. And what we would like to see more of and more transparently is what it is that DWP is choosing to automate. Because some of those things, they're sort of saying, we need this weight, or we need this sort of data, like health data or what have you. But it's not entirely clear that they've done everything they can to automate their own systems to make the pathway work for people in vulnerable circumstances, or sorry, vulnerable people in difficult circumstances, which they could have done already.
Thank you. Chris, did you want to come back on?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Chair. I do have further questions for Mr. Booth, but I'm just curious if Mr. Morgan maybe wants to say something around grants vis-a-vis advances. Mr. Morgan?
I think it's really very much a political choice. I think you can treat them either way. It's simply a cost to the Treasury and a benefit to the recipient. I think there are a number of kind of issues around how you pay sooner or whether you pay sooner, and the questions really are not about what you pay. It's how much it is and what it is, and those really are kind of Treasury issues. My suggestion about using an advance estimation and reconciliation presumably is going to be easier to administer from an administrative point of view. It would probably cost more because it's bringing forward a payment. Effectively, you're paying in advance rather than paying in arrears. But over the generational length of a benefit, that's probably not a huge amount of money, and presumably accounting terms would be treated quite differently from making a grant in the first place.
All right, thanks, Mr. Morgan. Mr. Booth, back to you. Just you've talked a lot about the automation and the system and how it's designed. So from October 2021, the repayment period for advances will be extended to 24 months and the maximum deduction cap will be reduced. Is there any reason why it's taking so long, and could those changes not be implemented sooner?
Well, I can't speak for DWP, and maybe to be a bit ungenerous, it seems to be a fear of a system which, as Tom Loosemore's described, is complex, not complicated. There are likely work plans, 12, 18-month work cycles. There is, we understand, an underlying 2-week tick to the agile process. So many changes, certainly the technical changes, the technological changes that we're talking about, could be implemented much quicker. But I think officials are fearful of how a change across the piece would play out in practice at, as Tom says, millions scale. So they become, in a way, so anxious, cautious, reluctant to make such changes that we see this much longer delay than would seem to be reasonable from the technical side of things. This is, I think, going back to what was said earlier on about maybe phasing things or what have you, is when or if people are given a choice, and I'm not saying the 24-month thing is a choice, but if people are given a choice and the system is modified to enable those choices, and so they are there within the infrastructure of the system and have been worked out, at least for part of the population, for example, the 2-week payment in Scotland, then you might be able to actually move cohorts until you've got a system that is doing what you want. Now, I don't think this is reasonable to do for what we're talking about right now, but it is an example of how it doesn't always have to be a big bang change, and that waiting a long period to just switch over everything is not the only way to approach all of these problems.
Yeah, Tom, do you have a view on this? Because I see you're shifting and nodding. I mean, the DWP announced this change 3 years in 2018. So why would it take 3 years to implement a change? What would appear to us to be a change in or simple changes to the automation system?
The honest truth is, I don't know. I'm not that close anymore. I think the crucial thing to remember here with this is that you're not really, the technology here is, there's a lot of code. It's a big system, it's a complicated system, but there's nothing remotely deeply complicated about the code. What is complicated and what is complex are how DWP frontline staff operate, tens of thousands of people, how they are trained, how they deal with the edge cases that we don't even know about because we're not close enough to them, that even moving from 12 to 24 months would give you. And the caution that Phil's alluded to, I think if we just reflect back to what Dr. Bryan said at the start about the big lesson that he learned, which was to be cautious. And I don't know why it's taken 3 years, but I can understand the operational caution about rolling out that kind of change. Having said that, I'd move it beyond 24 months. I think actually you have a big issue with people not realising the impact of deductions when they choose the scale of their advance at the start, and it hits them really hard thereafter. Anyway.
Well, it gets back to the original debate, doesn't it, about advances and repayable grants, but is there any other suggested changes you would have, Tom, around advances that would support people because of the struggles they would have with repayments and debt?
No, I'm not close enough to it, but I would encourage you to talk to the people at the front line of running universal credit. They're all incredible people, and it upsets me deeply that they get tarnished thus. This is the hardest system I've ever come across. So welfare systems generally globally are so much harder than anything in the private sector to deal with trade-offs and to deal with genuine complexity, as in the input does not equate to what you thought the outcome was going to be. And I think the teams involved in developing this system are the very best I have ever seen. And if they are cautious about something, I generally would respect that greatly. And again, I think what's really good about UC is that they have integrated the technology with the operations functions. They are deeply embedded, policy less so. So you will hear a story about the combination of what's hard technically with what's hard operationally, which is very healthy and globally unique, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, I think that's helpful, and I think you're right to recognise the staff, and I think that the frontline staff as well. And I think that I think you're right to say we should take evidence from them, and of course their trade unions. So, and I think that's something we can think about going forward. And I'll pass that back. Just for that closing thought, Chair, I'll pass back.
Thank you, Chris. I can see that Mr. Booth wants to chip in.
Sorry, just very quickly. I think what Tom said is vitally important. We're talking with frontline support services, citizen advice, child poverty action group, people who are trying to support people who are having difficulties with the system. And we have a transparency and interface problem. Not to be too polite about it, it would be easier if the technical people at DWP would get into a room with people like Med Financial and others so that we can translate what is going on, because a lot of the frustrations and problems that we are seeing, I think, have come from years of people being told, look, the computer system just can't do it. Yeah? So more transparency and a better interface in that regard, I think might actually help things go forward, and might sort of also feed into the process priorities and what have you, which I'm sure they're getting a bit of doing user sort of research anyway. So
you're saying that you can only talk to policy people, and as Mr. Loosemore has said, there's a bit of a separation between them and the technical people.
So there is a mismatch, and we say we have offered ourselves to go and talk to anyone technical to try to work out. I mean, we understand systems. We've been working on government systems for 15 years or more. And yet we still just get to these deadlock points, sometimes lasting for months, where civil society support organisations are simply stonewalled, told, it's too difficult, the computer can't do it, or what have you, and there's no meaningful discussion. We can get past that, but it requires a degree more transparency and openness.
Mr. Loosemore.
I mean, to your point, Stephen, I'm afraid that comes to the only the policy elite in the civil service are allowed to speak, and I am in a joyous position of being able to speak for those who are not allowed to speak, which is the technologists and the operational people. And I think it's safe to say that the frustration amongst the operational and technology people within DWP, that many times, not every time, but many times policy people write their own checks that they themselves don't have to cash, that the operations and technology team have to cash. And I would really encourage a much deeper embedding and longer duration of policy people staying with universal credit. We've got this problem of turnover of people within the policy elite all the time. Actually embedding properly policy people in universal credit, which was there at the start in 2013-14. There were some superb policy people, deeply embedded, sat next to the product managers, the technologists, the operational people. I'm afraid because that policy elite likes to go away into its dark cupboards and think great thoughts, again to be pejorative, that's causing these problems.
Right.
But Tom, isn't this a problem as well in terms of, sorry Chair, I'll just be quick with this question. You're intimating problems with turnover of staff. That's also a problem as well, isn't it, with the frontline staff, that there's turnover there. We want to make sure that the frontline staff are trained properly and that there's a consistency in how claimants are being dealt with.
Yeah, I would agree that the hardest, the real challenge here is an operational one, is a training one, is consistency of messages, and that's what takes time. Often it's not the technology that takes time, it's the retraining. But sometimes I wonder whether the policy people, they're here today, gone tomorrow, and to understand universal credit and its history is not something you pick up in 6 months, I'm afraid, however smart you are.
But I think one thing you're telling us, Mr. Loosemore, is that the technology people would quite like the chance to speak to citizens' advice, for example, and for that dialogue to happen, which doesn't happen at the moment.
Again, I don't think, the technologists and the operational people are sat together in teams. It's that combined conversation that once you get through the field, it's the fact that the policy people are the front door, and that front door works both ways. It works to the frustration that Phil's alluded to, that you can't get through it and you hit a dead end. I also think sometimes it works the other way as well, that there are some potentially healthy, interesting conversations to be had that tend to happen anyway quietly, but could be more healthily happened if they were more in the open.
Okay, Mr. Morgan, I can see indicating. Sorry about the bell.
Thank you. I wanted simply to add that from an advice and information sort of sector perspective, and that's a sector which has suffered enormously from cuts over the last decade, of course, that the experience is exactly the same. We see an enormous number of day-to-day flaws in the way that the system reacts and interacts with people in very different kinds of circumstances. And I know from talking to colleagues that they have spoken to frontline staff within DWP, and their response is always, well, we know, but it's not us that makes those kind of decisions. And certainly, even though there are notional channels of communication between kind of the advice sector and policy people, it does seem to be a one-way traffic that we speak but are not heard, and they speak and it's a pronouncement.
Right. Okay. Well, that's extremely interesting. Can I just finally ask each of you, or all of you collectively, whether there's anything else you think the committee ought to be looking at in our inquiry on the 5-week wait? Anything we haven't talked about already? Anything that anyone would want to add? Mr. Booth? No?
I think I'm okay. It's the basic point that if there are sets of rules, which, as Tom said, DWP can train its staff of civil servants to make consistent decisions, then it can quite clearly automate those decisions. I would ask the committee to be thinking in terms, I guess, of where those are not technical things, but it's just a political choice, policy choice.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Morgan?
I think I'd simply say that the 5-week wait is only the first period of a long sequence of periods that can cause problems, and you really need to be looking at issues around, for example, seasonality in self-employment, to recognise that there are problems that arise predictably because of the way in which the assessment period operates, not solely because of the length of the assessment period.
Thank you. And Mr. Loosemore?
I think specifically around the 5 weeks, I would encourage you to consider that the run-ons from legacy benefits, particularly as migration of existing welfare claimants on those benefits comes on, that's going to make a big difference, I think, the 2-week run-on. And don't lose sight of that, would be my final message.
Fine. Well, that's been a fascinating session, very, very interesting and very helpful to us as well. Thank you, all three of you, very much indeed for joining us. That brings our meeting to an end. Order, order.